When I was at university, I met a friend called Freddie. We got on really well and did most things together, like drinking, studying, and dating girls. Freddie's parents were quite well off. They owned a farm and land on a small isle off the coast of Scotland. On one weekend, he asked if I would like to go to the farm and meet them. It was Halloween on the Saturday, and he said his parents always put on an event for the local villagers. The event took place on Halloween night in some nearby woods that his parents owned. They would set up props and illusions and have scare actors jump out behind trees to frighten people. When I met Freddie's parents, they seemed like fun, eccentric type of people, and they welcomed me into their home. On late Halloween night, I stood with Freddie and his parents and other people from nearby villages on the edge of the woods around an open fire. We were drinking and laughing, having a good time. Then an air raid siren rang throughout the air. Everyone went silent. Then Freddie's dad said it was time, and I followed the crowd into the woods. The woods were dark and misty. At times all you could hear were twigs breaking and leaves crunching, but in between you could hear distant screams and manic voices. As we made our way through the woods, the sight of ghouls, demons and witches jumped out at us from behind the trees, making us jump with fright. It was all good fun, but in a scary way. Then we came to a clearing. I stood with Freddie and his parents with a crowd of other people, looking around in anticipation of what would happen next. It seemed eerily quiet, then the sound of a chainsaw rattled through the air. A masked figure of a man stood in front of us holding the chainsaw in his hands, repeatedly revving its motor. I looked around, smiling at the crowd of people, and noticed Freddie's dad looking concerned. He muttered we didn't hire anyone with a chainsaw. Me and Freddie looked at his dad in disbelief. "This isn't part of the act," he said quietly. Then above the sound of the chainsaw he shouted out, "This isn't part of the act. Run." The masked figure began running towards us, and the crowd screamed and dispersed in different directions through the woods. As I ran, my heart was beating fast. I had never felt so scared in my entire life. Then I heard a woman fall behind me. She screamed for help. I stopped and began to run back to help her, when all of a sudden the masked figure appeared from nowhere. Raising the chainsaw, the woman screamed, and then he sliced into her. Blood splattered onto my face. I felt sick and frozen to the spot. I turned away and covered my face with my hands. Then the air raid siren rang in the air. When it stopped, I dropped my hands from my face and could see the crowd of people all standing together facing me. At first their faces were solemn looking, then they all began laughing. I didn't understand. I was scared, angry and confused. Then I slowly turned round to face the masked figure with the chainsaw. And to my astonishment and relief, both he and the woman were standing and laughing too. It had all been fake, part of the act. But even so, whenever I hear the noise of a chainsaw, it sends chills down my spine. When I was a kid of about 12 or 13 years old, me and my friend Jason wanted to do something different for Halloween. We felt we were getting too old for the whole trick-or-treat thing, so we came up with the idea of camping out in a cemetery for the night. On Halloween, I told my parents I was spending the night round Jason's house. We spent the evening playing video games. Then when Jason's parents had gone to bed, we climbed out of Jason's bedroom window and made our way to the cemetery. It was a dark, misty night, and as I looked through the cemetery gates, I told Jason that maybe it wasn't a good idea after all. He just laughed and started to tease me that I was chicken. After we climbed the gates, we walked deeper into the cemetery. We set up a small 2-man tent in some bushes and then looked out into the darkness of the gravestones. Apart from the odd caw of a crow and the hoot of an owl, the cemetery was still and silent. For a while we watched the mist entwine itself around the stones. After a couple of hours I began to feel sleepy. My eyes felt heavy, then Jason nudged me awake. We saw what looked like the flickering light of a lantern float through the cemetery gates, and as it got nearer, we could see it was being carried by a tall, gaunt, hooded figure dressed in a long black cloak. The figure slowly strode by us in silence, holding the guttering light of the lantern high in front of him, illuminating a cold, death-like face. We followed the figure, hiding amongst the gravestones along the way, to a far corner of the cemetery. He stood by a freshly dug grave, holding aloft the lantern, chanting some words. Then we saw what looked like the ghost of a man rise from the grave. The man was kicking and screaming, shouting, "No, please God, no." The hooded figure said nothing and attached a chain to the ghost, and it made its way back towards the cemetery gates with the ghostly figure in tow. But as the death-like hooded figure passed the stone we were hiding behind, it stopped and looked straight at us. Its face was gaunt, with 2 grey cold eyes. We were both so scared that we froze to the spot. It felt like we were staring into death, our souls draining from our bodies. Then the figure half smiled and evaporated into the mist. Our bodies took a few seconds to recover, and it felt like we had just witnessed something we weren't supposed to. But it is something I can't and will never forget. Happy Halloween.